Hey guys, tonight we're staying up way past bedtime. The fluorescent lights are buzzing above me, making that low, steady hum that only gets loud when everything else in the building goes quiet. I'm sitting here in the A/V storage room, deep inside the forgotten wing of Blackwood High. It's almost 2 a.m., and the air smells like dust, old magnetic tape, and the faint, sweet decay of old textbooks. I usually pull these late shifts during exam week, compiling the senior slideshows, but tonight, the work feels secondary. There's something wrong with the silence, something heavy in the architecture. You know Blackwood, the one with the huge, Gothic clock tower that hasn't kept accurate time since the 1980s? That one. Something happened between the last bell yesterday and the moon cresting over the athletic field tonight. Something about the school's oldest, most fundamental identity shifted. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I need to keep this going, keep documenting, because honestly, I'm not sure anyone will see this footage if I can't find a way out by dawn. Now, dim the lights, maybe crack open a window for that midnight breeze, and let's walk the halls together. I had been editing the tribute video for Mrs. Albright, the chemistry teacher who finally retired after 40 years, when the main power flickered around 1:15 a.m. Not a surge, just a momentary dip, the kind that makes the old CRT monitor sigh and reform the image with a subtle thwomp. I saved the project instinctively, hearing the faint click of the emergency lights taking over in the main corridor outside the A/V office, those red-tinted, weak things that make the yellowed linoleum look like dried blood. It was annoying, but standard for Blackwood. The wiring here is ancient. The whole building is a sprawling monument to 1950s brutalism, all cinder block and echoing tile. I packed up my gear, sliding the borrowed school camera into its padded case. My route out is always the same. Down the C-wing stairs, past the deserted gymnasium, and out the staff exit near the maintenance dock. Simple. But as I walked past the darkened doors of the history classrooms, a sound stopped me, a sound that shouldn't exist this late. It was the faint, muffled scrape of chalk on a slate board, followed by a light tap, tap of a ruler. It sounded distant, maybe coming from the second floor, which is entirely shut down for asbestos abatement. I paused, leaning against the cold, rough texture of the cinder block wall. The sound didn't repeat, just the eternal, low whir of the air conditioning struggling to push air through the abandoned ducts. I dismissed it as structural noise, settling dust, or the ancient plumbing shifting. I continued toward the central atrium, the massive, three-story open space that is the heart of Blackwood High. This area is dominated by the monumental staircase, and, directly above the main doors, the school creed plaque. This plaque is a huge bronze rectangle, fixed to the concrete wall, perpetually covered in that thin layer of academic dust no cleaner can remove. It contains the school's founding date, 1951, and the motto, Sapientia et Perseverantia, wisdom and perseverance. As I stepped into the atrium, the emergency lights here seemed weaker than usual, throwing deep, wavering shadows off the concrete pillars. I looked up toward the plaque, maybe just to reassure myself of the familiarity, the unchanging constants of the building. But the bronze wasn't bronze anymore. It was still rectangular, still fixed to the wall, but it was painted over, freshly, starkly, in a matte, unsettling black. And the words? They were not Latin. They were not even in a font I recognized. They looked scraped, carved, then painted over with a thick, hasty white paint that dripped slightly at the edges. I stopped dead at the base of the staircase, my hand instinctively tightening around the strap of my camera bag. The faint, metallic smell of fresh, paint hung subtly in the stale air. The new inscription read, in jagged, block capital letters, "Here is where you stay. Do not seek the exit." My immediate, rational thought was, senior prank. But this wasn't spray paint. This was a deliberate, large-scale operation, likely involving scaffolding and hours of work, all done after the custodians went home at 11:30 p.m. And why would a prank use such chilling, non-traditional language? A prank should be funny or scandalous. This was just ominous. I pulled out my phone. 2:03 a.m. No signal, of course. That's Blackwood for you. The phone worked fine for recording, but external communication was always spotty deep inside the building. I walked closer to the plaque, the sound of my sneakers squeaking sharply on the polished tile floor. The white paint was matte and thick, almost chalky. I reached up and pressed a finger against the bottom edge. It was dry to the touch, impossibly fast drying, or perhaps it had been finished much earlier than I realized. I stared at the motto, "Here is where you stay." It felt less like a warning and more like a declaration of ownership. The cold weight of the silence pressed down. I needed to leave. If the seniors were still here, vandalizing the main hall, I wanted no part of the inevitable cleanup or the ensuing investigation. My car was parked in the faculty lot, just beyond the glass-fronted double doors. I walked quickly toward the main exit doors. They were the original 1950s heavy, aluminum-framed doors, always secured by a push-bar lock after hours. I grabbed the cold metal bar, pushed hard, and felt nothing give. The lock mechanism was dead. I tried the key slot, fumbling with my keyring, but the key wouldn't turn. The cylinder seemed fused shut, solid, unmoving. This was impossible. The custodians always checked this door last. I pressed my face against the dusty, cold glass. Through the grime, I could see the faculty parking lot. My car was there, under the high sodium vapor lamp, glistening faintly from the slight night dampness. Everything looked normal outside, except that I couldn't get to it. I took a deep breath, the dry, metallic air scratching the back of my throat. I looked back at the new motto, which seemed to glow faintly in the red emergency light. Do not seek the exit. Maybe the exit was simply jammed. Maybe I needed to try the maintenance dock exit instead. The realization settled in with a dull ache. I was stuck here, at least until I found someone to open a door, or until dawn. But the cold, hard certainty of that new motto, that declaration of permanence, had already scratched away the edges of my rational thinking. I think some lessons were never meant to be taught. The C-wing exit, the one leading to the maintenance dock, is usually just a few hundred feet from the main atrium, a straight shot past the trophy display cases. Tonight, that distance felt like crossing a desert. As I walked, the faint echo of my own footsteps bounced back at me from the high, dark ceiling. The old, standard-issue lockers, olive green and prone to rusting at the bottom, stood like silent, metallic sentinels on either side of the hall. I ran my hand over their cold, textured surface as I passed, grounding myself in the physical reality of Blackwood. I reached the corner where the hall should turn sharply right toward the dock entrance. But it didn't turn right. Instead, the corridor kept going straight. I stopped. I knew this building intimately. The C-wing always terminated in the maintenance dock corridor. Always. There was no straight continuation. After the last history classroom, C-114, there should be the janitorial storage closet, the emergency fire hose cabinet, and then the T-junction for the exit. Now, there was only the hallway stretching forward, seemingly identical to the one I had just traversed. Same pale green tiles, same buzzing lights, same configuration of lockers, except these ones bore slightly different numbers. Higher sequence numbers that belonged to the D-wing, a section of the school located on the other side of the cafeteria complex. My heart started knocking against my ribs, an urgent, frantic rhythm that seemed disproportionately loud in the silence. I pulled out my phone again and started recording, aiming the lens down the impossible corridor. "Okay," I whispered, the sound immediately swallowed by the air. "This is C-Wing. I should be at the dock exit. I'm not. This looks like D-Wing. But D-Wing is 2 major sections away." I checked the numbers on the lockers closest to me. D-201 to D-215. The C-Wing numbers stopped at C-198. There was a topological break here, a physical shift in the layout that defied the school's own blueprints. I walked cautiously down the D-Wing section that had spontaneously appeared. The air here felt noticeably colder, and there was a subtle, pervasive smell of chlorine and damp concrete, the smell associated with the abandoned natatorium located in the basement beneath the D-Wing. I remembered the Blackwood campus map, a meticulous diagram I digitized for the yearbook last semester. The D-Wing extension was bordered on one side by a steep, unlit service stairwell that led down to the boiler room, and on the other by a thick, weight-bearing wall separating it from the auditorium stage rigging area. It was structurally impossible for this hallway to connect directly to the C-Wing. I reached the end of this new, imported section. It terminated at a heavy, unmarked steel door. Not an exit door, just a utility door, thick and gray. I put my ear to the cold steel. I heard the muffled, high-pitched thrum of high-voltage machinery, possibly the massive, archaic boiler downstairs. I pushed the handle. Locked. Turning around, I scanned the long, empty corridor, trying to pinpoint where the transition had occurred. The C-Wing/D-Wing junction felt seamless, like a section of the building had been pulled and pasted, shifting the geography by hundreds of feet. I walked back, retracing my steps, moving faster now, the quiet terror starting to override simple anxiety. When I reached the place where the impossible hallway met the familiar corridor, I saw the history classroom, C-114. I tried the door handle. It opened easily. I stepped inside. The room was dark, the desks shrouded in lunar light filtering through the high windows. The air was thick with the scent of old wood polish and dry erase marker. I moved toward the teacher's desk, fumbling for the light switch. When the fluorescent tubes sputtered to life with a crackle and a harsh white flash, I looked up at the wall next to the door. This room, C-114, contained the school's historical archives, a locked glass case containing old student records, early photos, and, most importantly, the founding yearbooks. I remembered pulling the oldest book, the 1952 edition, just 2 weeks ago to verify a caption about the original gym floor. I rushed to the archive case. The lock was simple, a standard skeleton key, but I didn't have it. I peered through the glass. The yearbooks were there, stacked chronologically, spines facing outward. But the earliest book wasn't 1952. The first book on the stack was labeled, in fading Gothic script, The Blackwood Keeper, AD 1927. Blackwood High was founded in 1951. I knew this as fact. It was on the plaque, and the school's charter was stored digitally in the district office. A school couldn't simply gain 24 years of history overnight. I stared at the spine of the 1927 book. The paper looked brittle, the edges browned by time and neglect. I pressed my palm against the glass. The glass felt impossibly cold, colder than the metal lockers outside. If the geography was wrong, and the history was wrong, what was the school trying to become? I leaned against a cold metal filing cabinet, running a hand over the rough texture of the paint. The building felt like it was shifting its identity, shedding its known structure for something older, deeper, and more sinister. The realization that I was trapped inside a mutable structure, a school rewriting its own rules, made the previous fear of a prank seem comforting. This was geological horror. I think some lessons were never meant to be taught, especially when they involve a history that never actually happened. I needed to get into that basement, the old boiler room access near the shifted D wing. If anyone was responsible for this, they had to be using the hidden infrastructure of the school. The air in the long, dark corridor leading to the administration wing was dry and charged, smelling faintly of old paper and ozone. I kept walking, hugging the wall, the camera running silently. I was moving toward the principal's office, P-101. The administrative offices housed the master controls for the intercom and PA system, the logical place to check for any strange, authoritative voice that might have decreed the new motto. The administration wing is notoriously dark, even during the day, due to its low ceilings and heavy oak paneling. At 2:45 a.m., it was swallowed by shadow. The only light came from a single, sickly green exit sign glowing at the end of the hall. As I approached P-101, I heard it again, sound emanating from the speakers recessed into the ceiling tiles. Not the chalk scrape, but a soft, repetitive electronic pulse. It was the rhythm of a rotary dial tone, the persistent thrum-click of an old, analog telephone line attempting to connect. It was so faint I could only confirm it by stopping completely and holding my breath. The door to the principal's office was locked, but I noticed something unusual about the lock itself. The brass plate was tarnished, yes, but the keyhole was larger, older, clearly not the modern standard cylinder lock the school installed 5 years ago. This was another anachronism, like the 1927 yearbook. The building was regressing, stripping away layers of renovation to reveal something that should have been sealed decades ago. I moved past the outer office toward the records room, where I knew there was a shallow ventilation grate I could perhaps pry open. But before I reached it, the door to the maintenance closet, usually bolted shut, stood slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly. The scent of solvent and floor wax hit me immediately. The space was tiny, stacked high with mops and buckets, but on the back wall, behind a stack of unused air filters, was a hidden panel. It looked like a section of the wall that had been poorly replastered. I used the edge of a forgotten ruler I found on a nearby desk to scrape at the seam. The plaster was brittle and gave way easily, revealing a small cavity lined with brick, and inside, glowing faintly with its own internal residual light, was a communication console. This wasn't the sleek, modern digital intercom panel the school uses now. This was a monster of 1940s technology. Heavy bakelite dials, glowing vacuum tubes, and thick, cloth-wrapped wiring leading into the dark ceiling. It was the original Blackwood PA system, rumored to be disconnected during the 60s renovation. The console was active. A small, amber light was blinking rhythmically next to a metal switch labeled Broadcast, Main Hall. The source of the new motto announcement, or any disturbing message, wasn't coming from the active network. It was coming from this relic, this heart of the old school. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the dials. The faceplate was cold, almost slick. As I moved my hand, I saw my own reflection distorted slightly in the curved plastic of the dial cover. But the reflection wasn't quite mine. It was elongated, stretched thin, and behind my reflected head, a deep, featureless shadow seemed to detach itself from the corner of the small room and hover. I yanked my hand back, stumbling against a mop bucket. The clatter of the plastic echoed briefly, then died unnaturally fast. I looked back at the reflection. It was just me now, pale and wide-eyed, reflected normally in the slightly dusty plastic. but the cold dread of that detached shadow reflection lingered. It was a momentary glimpse of something mobile and predatory moving just outside my frame of perception. I focused back on the panel. The rotary thrum click was still coming from the ceiling speaker, originating from this antique box. I traced the wire leading to the main broadcast switch. There was no tape, no physical input device. The system was broadcasting pure, unedited static, interrupted only by that phantom dial tone. Then, the thrumming stopped. A clear, deep voice, devoid of inflection but undeniably human, crackled through the tiny speaker on the wall unit, sounding vast and hollow. Attendance is mandatory. Departures are not on record. The voice repeated the phrase 3 times, each time fading slightly, as if the speaker were walking further down an endless corridor while delivering the message. The sheer, logistical impossibility of the statement, a live broadcast from a supposedly decommissioned system, crushed any remaining hope that this was a physical intruder. The school was communicating. I shut the maintenance door quickly, plunging the administrative hall into near-total darkness again. I backed away, my eyes wide, fixed on the closed door, expecting it to fly open. I think some lessons were never meant to be taught, especially the rules governing the building's sentience. I needed to move fast, away from the core administrative control. The idea that this school could dictate attendance policies in the deep night, using a ghost PA system, solidified the horrific scope of my entrapment. I had to find the stairwell leading to the basement and the boiler room. If the school was regenerating its oldest parts, the foundations might hold a physical weakness, a point where the "here is where you stay" decree could be broken. I spun around and ran, my shoes squeaking on the polished tiles of the administration wing, heading for the service access point I'd located earlier in the impossible D-wing section. The air behind me felt heavy, as though the oak paneling itself was watching my retreat. I reached the service access point in the imported D-wing section, the one I had found when the corridor spontaneously extended. The heavy, unmarked utility door stood exactly where I left it. I felt the overwhelming impulse to leave a marker, anything, to confirm the location was stable, but I had no permanent tools. I settled for kicking a small pile of plaster dust left by construction into a distinct heap near the door frame. I tried the steel door again. This time, I didn't push the handle. I realized that if the school was reverting to older systems, the locks might be mechanical. I looked for a hidden keyhole or latch. My fingers traced the cold surface, the texture rough and faintly greasy from years of maintenance use. I found it, a nearly invisible key slot disguised within a rivet head, requiring not a key, but pressure. I pushed hard with my thumb on the rivet, and with a heavy, grinding thunk, the internal mechanism disengaged. I pulled the door open. Beyond was not the dark stairwell I expected, but a small, cramped landing leading to a steep, vertical ladder descending into pitch blackness. The smell was intense: mineral dust, hot metal, and the sharp, coppery scent of ancient rust. I clipped the camera to my jacket and started down the ladder, wrung by cold, slick rung. The air thickened with every foot of descent. I was descending into the sublevels, the realm beneath the foundation. This felt like more than just a boiler room. This felt like a cistern, a buried cavity far deeper than Blackwood's official 2-level basement. I counted the rungs. I went down for what felt like 30 feet, at least 2 stories deeper than the deepest utility area on the blueprints. When my feet finally hit ground, the space was vast, cavernous, and humid. The walls were not cinder block or concrete, but rough-hewn, wet rock, indicating I was below the bedrock level. in a space that surely predated the school's construction. I pulled out the phone/camera, using the screen as my only source of light. The ground was slick, muddy silt. I moved slowly, following the massive pipes, thick, sweating veins of copper and iron, that led further into the darkness. These pipes weren't just supplying the school. They looked like they were feeding something. I found the boiler room, but it was nothing like the modern, compact unit installed during the last renovation. This was a monster, a massive, squat, coal-fired boiler from the turn of the century, its metal skin blackened and warped by decades of heat. It wasn't actively burning coal, but it was emitting a steady, internal heat that baked the air around it. And it was humming, not the low whir of the air ducts, but a deep, resonant ohm that vibrated in my chest cavity. I noticed something disturbing hanging on a rusty peg near the boiler's pressure gauge, a coat. A heavy, dark wool overcoat, perfectly preserved, slightly damp, but clearly not worn recently. Next to it, leaning against the wall, was an open metal lunch pail containing a petrified, half-eaten sandwich and a rusty thermos. I touched the wool of the coat. It felt stiff and cold. This wasn't the abandoned property of a custodian. This was the abandoned property of someone who had never left. Someone who had accepted the mandate of the motto long ago. The stairs. I looked at the lunch pail, finding an old plastic ID card tucked under the handle. It was faded and warped, but the photo was clear. A young man, perhaps 19 or 20, wearing a maintenance uniform. The card dated him to 1968. He was not listed in any employee records I had seen in the administrative files. He was simply forgotten, incorporated into the structure. The silence here was different. Upstairs, the silence was an absence of sound. Down here, the silence was a constant pressure, like the atmosphere was trying to squeeze all the sound waves out of existence. I tried to hear the wind outside or the distant traffic on the highway. Nothing. The school had become acoustically insulated from the outside world. I realized the danger was not just being trapped, but being digested. The school was consuming me, integrating me into its structure, turning my presence into another forgotten artifact, like the coat and the sandwich. I walked past the boiler, deeper into the sublevel tunnels. I was looking for the structural weaknesses, the joints in the bedrock where the school met the natural earth. Suddenly, the humming intensified. The air grew immediately hotter. I looked up. A single, bare bulb, hanging from a thick wire, flickered to life 20 feet ahead of me, illuminating a heavy, riveted bulkhead door set into the rock. It looked like the hatch to a submarine. As the light stabilized, I saw the surface of the door was not metal, but reflective glass, heavily reinforced. And within that glass, I saw movement. It wasn't my reflection. It was a shifting, deep current, like staring into highly pressurized, static water, the impossible liquid that only exists in forgotten subterranean places. And within that current, I saw the brief, shimmering outline of Blackwood High, suspended upside down, submerged in something vast and deep, like a ghost ship. I think some lessons were never meant to be taught, especially the mechanics of what holds a school above ground. The world outside Blackwood was not blocked. It was simply separated, submerged, existing in a parallel plane the school had chosen to abandon. The idea of seeking the exit now felt truly futile. I needed to find the gym, the largest cavity of the building. Maybe there, the illusion of permanence was thinnest. I retreated quickly from the sight of the submerged school in the bulkhead glass, climbing the cold ladder back to the surface. My hands were shaking, not just from the cold metal, but from the realization that the basement wasn't below Blackwood. It was Blackwood's anchor, rooting it somewhere impossibly deep. Back in the D-Wing corridor, The air felt thin and dry after the oppressive humidity of the sublevel. I moved toward the main junction that led to the athletic complex, the locker rooms, the gym, and the infamous Blackwood pool, which had been permanently drained and cemented over in the late 1990s due to endless maintenance issues. As I walked, the buzzing of the fluorescent lights above me became erratic, flickering at increasing speed, until they weren't flickering but pulsing, syncing with a new sound filtering through the ceiling tiles. Low, distorted, melodic music. It sounded like an old, scratched '78 record playing a melancholic waltz, the kind of music you'd hear at a deserted dance hall. The proximity to the gym was usually marked by the smooth, varnished wood floor giving way to industrial rubber matting. Tonight, the transition was abrupt and unsettling. The moment my foot crossed the threshold into the gym wing, the lights went dead, plunging the corridor into moonlit silver. The light source wasn't the windows. It was the massive, arched windows of the gym itself, visible through the interior entrance doors. The windows, which usually overlook the athletic fields, seemed to show only a flat, heavy gray expanse, featureless and silent. I moved into the boys' locker room. The smell of disinfectant and lingering sweat was replaced by a sharp, chemical tang, like concentrated rust dissolving in brine. The lockers here were huge, full-sized athletic lockers, cold steel giants lined up in silent rows. I heard the sound again, a faint, rubbery squeak. The sound of gym shoes on varnished wood. It came from inside the gym proper. I crept toward the double doors of the gym. I pushed them open just a crack, peering into the cavernous space. The main gymnasium court was massive, the wooden floor reflecting the cold, alien moonlight. The bleachers were pulled out on both sides, metallic tiered seats stretching into the gloom. And on the floor, beneath the ghostly light, there was movement. They weren't human. They were shadows, elongated and impossibly thin, moving with a jerky, stop-motion quality, enacting a basketball game. The rubbery squeak was their phantom movement. The thump and echo was the sound of a ball that wasn't there, hitting the court. The shadows moved without corresponding sources. They were reflections of motion past, or perhaps motion that was occurring in a dimension superimposed onto the gym floor. I watched, frozen. The spectral game was silent save for the phantom squeak and the occasional hollow thud of the imagined ball. The figures never looked up. They were trapped in the repetitive routine of the game, a perpetual state of academic exercise. I backed away from the gym, moving toward the adjacent pool complex, which was supposed to be decommissioned. I needed to see the cement slab. I found the door to the pool viewing area. I forced it open. The space was enormous, designed with high, tiled walls that amplified every sound. I stepped onto the cold, dusty viewing platform. Below me, the massive concrete basin of the pool was indeed there, but it wasn't cemented over. It was full of a liquid that was not water. It was thick, viscous, and absolutely still. The surface reflected the moonlight with a disturbing, oily sheen. The liquid was a uniform, opaque black, and it emitted the same unsettling chemical brine smell I noticed in the locker room. It looked like static, pressurized darkness, contained within the high tiles. As I watched, a single, minute ripple appeared at the center of the black liquid. Then another, larger one, originating from nowhere. It was a disturbance from within the depth. I realized this was the substance I had seen reflected in the bulkhead glass in the basement, the liquid the school was submerged in. This pool wasn't a recreational area. It was a physical manifestation of the boundary between the school and the abyssal space it now occupied. I leaned against the railing, the cold metal digging into my palms. I felt the profound weight of the school's shift. It hadn't just changed its motto, it had changed its entire cosmological position. I think some lessons were never meant to be taught, especially the geometry required to contain a body of water that defies gravity and physics. The terror now wasn't of being caught, but of being absorbed into the stasis of Blackwood. I had to return to the heart, the central atrium where the motto was written. If the message was an edict, the source of the authority had to be there. I needed to see the plaque one last time, in case it had shifted again, demanding a new, darker form of compliance. My run back toward the central atrium was a blur of flickering overhead bulbs, cold, slick tiles, and the persistent, mocking waltz music growing louder the closer I got to the administrative core. I bypassed the impossible D-wing section entirely, taking the long way around the cafeteria, past the empty serving counters that smelled faintly of stale grease and metal cleaner. When I burst back into the main atrium, the atmosphere had undergone a dramatic shift. The red emergency lights were gone. All overhead lights, even the faint, residual ambient glow, were extinguished. The atrium was dark, illuminated only by the thin, cold light of the moon filtering through the massive entrance windows, the ones I couldn't open. And the motto plaque was pulsing. It wasn't glowing, but the crude white paint of the lettering, "Here is where you stay. Do not seek the exit," was visibly contracting and expanding, a slow, rhythmic respiration that made the words seem three-dimensional, like thick, carved muscle tissue. I stood at the base of the monumental staircase, looking up at the breathing declaration. The waltz music was coming from the second floor, likely the auditorium stage area directly above the plaque. I needed to see the stage. I started up the wide, carpeted steps, the deep, silent pile of the old rug muffling my frantic ascent. Halfway up, the stairs felt soft beneath my feet, giving slightly with each step, like ascending a mound of damp earth rather than concrete and steel. I reached the second-floor landing. The air here was strangely still, cold, and smelled overwhelmingly of theater makeup and mildew. I could see the double doors leading to the auditorium, heavy oak doors that usually have the school schedule pinned to them. Tonight, they were bare, and one was slightly ajar. I pushed the door open the rest of the way. The auditorium was a vast, dark vault. The seating was invisible in the darkness, but the stage was bathed in an unnatural, solitary light, a sickly green spotlight aimed directly at the center stage. And there, standing in the center of the spotlight, was a figure. I couldn't make out its features, as the light was too harsh and focused, but it was tall and thin, wearing what looked like the uniform of an old-school master, a dark, tweed jacket and thin spectacles reflecting the green light. It was standing perfectly still, utterly motionless, like a forgotten exhibit. The waltz music was deafening here, pulsing through the auditorium speakers, vibrating the floorboards beneath my feet. Suddenly, the figure moved, not walking, but gliding, a smooth, impossible slide across the varnished stage floor, stopping right at the edge, facing the dark sea of seats where I stood. I raised the camera phone, my hands shaking violently, trying to record the figure, but the harsh green light overwhelmed the sensor, turning the image into a blinding white flare. The figure raised one hand slowly, a thin, unnaturally long finger pointing directly at the glowing, breathing plaque visible through the windows of the auditorium doors behind me. And then, the voice, the same deep, hollow, PA system voice from the administrative core, filled the vast space, amplified and echoing off the walls. The lesson is completed. The exit has been removed from the curriculum. The pressure in the room became intolerable. My ears felt blocked, my vision narrowed. The very structure of the building, seemed to be collapsing inward around the command. I turned and scrambled back down the stairs, no longer caring about silence, just frantic escape from the sheer authority of that presence. As I hit the atrium floor, I looked back up at the motto plaque. The writing was fading now, the white paint dissolving into the matte black background, revealing the underlying material, not bronze, but rough, dark stone, ancient and pitted. I ran back toward the main entrance doors, the aluminum frames now seeming to melt slightly into the concrete surround. I hammered on the cold glass, uselessly, looking out at the parking lot. But the parking lot wasn't there anymore. Beyond the glass, where the asphalt, the sodium lamp, and my car should have been, there was only the vast, featureless gray expanse I had seen through the gym windows. A heavy, silent field of utter nothingness, stretching to an impossible horizon. The school hadn't locked the doors. It had simply excised the outside world. I dropped my camera bag. The faint, echoing waltz music followed me, dissolving into the structure of the building. I slid down against the cold, hard tile of the wall, my legs no longer supporting me. I think some lessons were never meant to be taught, especially the final one about the true nature of confinement. Blackwood High wasn't a structure built on land. It was a vessel floating in oblivion, and I was now part of the crew. I looked at the dissolving motto one last time. The final words, the only words remaining before the plaque turned completely to featureless, black stone, were, "Here is where you stay." The pulsing stops. The sudden cessation of the music leaves a vacuum of sound that hurts my ears. I am sitting on the cold tiles of the atrium floor, my back pressed against the wall, listening to the slow, steady drip of water somewhere far off in the darkness. Perhaps the condensate from the impossible boiler, deep below the stone. The air settles into a familiar, deep night stillness, the kind of silence that has texture like velvet or dust. Above me, the standard fluorescent bulbs do not come back on, but a gentle, steady, blue light begins to emanate from the ceiling speakers, spreading a faint, ethereal glow over the central staircase and the smooth, polished floor. I close my eyes. I can hear the subtle movement of air through the old ventilation system, no longer a struggle, but a quiet, rhythmic breath. The lockers lining the deserted hall sigh faintly, the metal contracting in the persistent, cold air. One piece of paper, maybe an old assignment, maybe a forgotten student